It's the largest Golden Demon project I've ever attempted. I've researched and planned. I've built the scene, I've painted the large, grueling sections, but now with only a little over a month until the competition, I've reached the turning point in this project. So today we're going to break down how I painted these extremely important details, but equally as importantly, why they're going to make such a big impact on this project. We all know that the head and shoulder regions of our models are the most important. They are what draw the eye of the viewer, and that's why what we're working on today is going to make or break this entire project. And that's not to say that all the laborious hours we spent painting the skin and the skirt of Vizek aren't important. But enough of the jibber jabber. We've got some very important sections to paint here, actually things that are very commonly used in Warhammer models, and there's a couple of tips I've learned along the way from painting these that I think will be valuable to all of us. The first thing we're going to paint is chainmail, something most of us have probably painted before, and I gotta say it is kind of a pain in the ass to make chainmail actually look good. And I'm starting with this because it's the bottommost part of the layered sections of materials on all of this shoulder armor detail. I'm starting with a black contrast paint instead of regular black paint because it's going to flow easily between the rings and create our deepest shadows. And here's where chainmail gets tricky. You see, it's one of those weird surfaces that is composed of a lot of tiny things, but it also creates a larger shape when you look at them as a whole. Another great example of this is hair. You want to highlight it as if it's one large object for the most part. So I'm using a series of grays to build up the sections of mail that are lifted or raised to face the light from above, while keeping the more vertical sections darker. It's important to note that whether you're using a tiny brush like I am here or a large dry brush, the same rule applies. Follow the contour of the mail and over-exaggerate the brighter areas while keeping the darkest areas almost untouched. Now, to add some interest and color to this mail, I'm going to add some weathering in the form of rust. This does a great job of not only bringing color interest, but it also hides some of the monotony in areas of the chainmail you don't think look quite right. I thinned down this rust paint pretty heavily so we can fade it into the darker areas and build it up naturally in the brighter areas over a few thin coats. Final step is to bust out a pure bright white, to punch up some of the brightest areas that are shining through that rusty metal. And this is where we really sell it as a metallic effect. If you're using metallic paint to paint your own chainmail at home, just grab the brightest silver you own for this final dotting step. And be sure to only touch the bottom central upward facing part of the ring for this dotting step, because that's the only part that would actually catch the pure reflection of the light above. Now, when you're painting a model start to finish, section by individual section, it can be really hard to tell if a certain section, once it's complete, actually looks good or not when the rest of the model is still covered in primer. So I'm going to move on to the next section so we can get more of this model painted and decide if we need to go back to any of the other sections and touch them up later. I decided I wanted to paint these massive triangular shoulder plates as black metal because it'll allow us to frame the head and horns above them really well as help the scarf thingy pop later when we paint it red. One of the tricks to painting black is to not actually start with pure black. You want to start very dark, but you need to be able to go darker for your shadows with a pure black later. By mixing a dark desaturated blue with a black in a 50-50 mix, we get a very dark color that'll read as black, especially once we add in some shadows. And to create those shadows, I mix a glaze of pure black and hit all of the areas that would be darkest where the plates join or vertical sections rise up, but I also use it to follow the hammered texture of the flat sections of the plate. I then come back in with a 2-to-1 mix of our gray to black. I thin it down to a heavy glaze consistency and gently pull up the raised sections of these imperfections on the flat plates. If we want this to read as black, it's really important that we don't go too bright too quickly here. It's also important that we don't cover up most of our base color. If we do, the armor will start to read more like steel than a really dark metal. The key is that we need to keep a lot of this section quite dark. We'll go brighter in very controlled areas to push up the shine that tells us that this material is actually metal, but again, it's in very, very small areas. Dotting the rivets and creating small scratchy highlights around the edges of raised areas is all I'm really focusing on at this point. At this point, I decided I wanted to push the scratches and highlights just a bit brighter, and I'm not sure, this might have been a little bit too over the top. We won't know for sure, again, until we finish all the surrounding areas, but it's an easy fix. If you do go too bright, you can just take that really thin down pure black glaze and apply it over these sections to dull them back down. We definitely need some color depth at this point, so when in doubt, you rust it out. I don't think that's a real phrase. Adding rust and grime is truly one of my favorite steps to painting metal. It reminds me how much life we can bring to our miniatures by adding a simple depth of color. I use Rhinox hide to get a really dark brown to start. I don't want to go too bright with this rust because if I do, it's going to overpower the black armor. Even just a little bit of this, then a slightly brighter, warm Doombull brown in the areas where moisture would collect seems just about perfect. You know, you can come up with your own rust recipe from just about any paint manufacturer. The one that I lean on the most would be Rhinox hide, Doombull brown, and Scrag brown, all by Citadel. Now that the rust step is done, I'm going to do the same thing I did with the chainmail. Come back in for one final pass of brightest highlights. Again, I'm using dots and scratches here. There will be no perfect edge highlights. This is worn and beaten metal. It's not going to have perfect lines and crisp edges. The scratchiness will also create some really fun contrast because it's right next to the smooth rat skin that these plates are covering. Now, this basic approach to non-metallic metal for any dark steel, iron, or black metal works just great. In fact, it's a really easy way to dip your toes into painting non-metallic metal. Because this stuff isn't super shiny, it's not actually going to reflect a lot of the colors in the surrounding environment. In fact, figuring out this recipe makes me kind of want to paint some Black Templar Space Marines, but I got a big Golden Demon project to finish, so no Space Marines today. All right, on to painting copper. And I'm going to be honest with you for a second here. Painting colored metals like gold, copper, bronze, it's like a fucking magical mystery to me. I don't really know how to do it very well. It's like magnets. How do they work? Nobody knows. Nobody knows. So I did my research and watched some videos by Trevarian and Vince Vincerella on painting copper, and I wrapped my mind around some key aspects of this Illuminati mysticism, and shall venture forth and see what happens. After a terracotta-esque looking base coat, I added some orange-brown to the mix and started pushing up our highlights on this tampered metal plate texture we have on these pizza slices. Today's video is brought to us by Into the AM, and by now, you've probably heard me rave about their amazing graphic tees, and for good reason. Phasing out all of my old, poorly fitting t-shirts for a massive variety of styles that Into the AM offers was the easiest upgrade I've ever made to my wardrobe in over a decade. But what you may not realize is all the other great things that they have in addition to their tees. You know, I've filled out my wardrobe so much more thanks to Into the AM, and they've made it so dang easy. For example, they make the best zip-up hoodie sweatshirts on the planet. Believe me, I'm kind of an expert in this. These are my go-to in my wardrobe. I own a bazillion. I have purchased from everywhere, but now that I know that Into the AM makes the best, most comfortable, best fitting ones, I don't buy them from anywhere else. They also have a ton of other great staples that'll fit perfectly into your wardrobe. One of my favorites is their wide variety and great fitting flannels. I've been slowly transitioning all of my flannels into these by Into the AM, keeping my eye out for sales so I get the most lumberjack look for my buck. But now is the perfect time to save big. That's because their anniversary sale is going on right now. That means up to 50% off everything on their website, including some amazing bundle deals. So whether you've purchased from Into the AM before or you need that slight kick in the butt to try them out for the first time, let today be that kick. Use the link down in the video description below, and with that you get an extra savings on top of the already best prices for their annual sale. A big thank you to Into the AM for keeping the shirt on my back, both literally and figuratively. It seems like one of the keys are to push closer to a pure orange with this first highlight, which is going to cover most of our surface. We're just keeping the darkest areas untouched to show the texture of these Little Caesar delights. What's interesting is here is where we stop pushing towards pure orange. Instead, we're going to try to brighten and desaturate. Because copper is a highly reflective material, it tends to desaturate as it gets brighter. So I decided to add an ochre yellow into the mix as I brighten up the highlights further. This keeps our warmth as we go brighter, but kind of sidesteps pure orange like that one kid that's really good at flag football in elementary school. Wasn't one of my best jokes. This is a bit of a trial by fire experimentation. Yes, I've painted non-metallic copper before, but it's been quite a while and I don't really like how it turned out there. But I think with a little bit of effort, we could maybe bring this home. As I push the desaturation more as I go brighter and brighter, I have a glimmer of hope that I'm actually on the right track. Does this look like it's actually copper? No, but maybe it's kind of getting closer. When I get to the point where I'm highlighting with a really bright peach color, it does start to feel like copper, at least in these highlights. I think the overall tone of the plates is not quite there. It seems overall not coppery enough. I actually think now is the time to start building back that saturation to feel more like copper. And Gryph-hound Orange, the contrast paint, is really, really good for this. I've learned today. You actually just thin it down with some water and you gently put small coats over top of what you've painted so far. And what this got me to realize is I don't actually know if this was a mistake I'm trying to remedy later, or if the natural progression to paint a desaturated copper tone will naturally make you lose all that saturation, and this is just the second step to bring it back into where it's supposed to be. Sometimes when we paint, we need to work up to brighter and brighter highlights, and in doing so, we naturally lose color saturation. But it's really hard to build up those highlights without that color loss. That's what makes this tinting step so important to pull everything together. It also has the added bonus of smoothing out all of those color transitions that we did underneath. I come back in with one more super bright peach highlight to really punch the shiniest sections, and then we're going to move on to weathering. We need to push the oxidation that copper undergoes in natural environments, and I'm going to use a dark turquoise for this so we can create some drama in that shadow with these darker tones. I thin this down with a lot of Lahmian medium and water so we have control in how quickly we build up this potent tone. This copper necklace does have some warp stones lodged into it, and to paint those, I'm actually going to use a more refined recipe that I discovered while painting my Skaven army earlier this year. Fuck me, why did I say earlier this year? It's 2025, I painted it in 2024. After painting the stones pure white, I hit them with a nice thick coat of Caran-Dras green contrast paint. This stuff packs a massive punch, and I think there's a bit of fluorescent pigment in it that it gives us almost a glowing effect. From here, I mix just a little bit of that green with pure white paint to create a bright off green color, and I use that to edge highlight all of the edges on each of these stones. The last step is just some pure white on the edges and corners, then finish up with a very thin down layer of the contrast paint again to pull all of those edge highlights back in. The copper was a section I was a bit nervous about because I wasn't sure exactly of the recipe, but I'm pretty chuffed at how it turned out. Is that the proper use of that term? Chuffed? Anyway, one final section to complete, and it's the one that is stressing me out the most because it involves dreaded freehand painting. But we'll cross that road when we get there. For now, we just bust out my big old brush and start laying down my base coats, wet blending them right on the scarf. I want the scarf to get ratty and faded at its frayed edges, so I'm going to work in some khaki tones as we work closer to the edge of the ripped up sections. It's important to remind myself that this wet blending base coat doesn't need to be perfect. It's okay if there isn't perfect opaque coverage. It's okay if some of the shadow color lands where it's not supposed to be. That can all be remedied later. I'm just trying to get a good start on the foundation colors based on the folds of the cloth. Oh, there's also a small section of this scarf that I have to paint separately because it falls over the right bicep of Vizic, and it can't actually be glued together with the rest of the scarf until we fit this whole shoulder section on once everything is painted, which is kind of a pain of the butt because it means I have to gap fill and smooth out where those two scarf sections meet and repaint over that whole part to make sure that the colors match up. But what are you going to do? I use thin glazes of the red over rougher sections to smooth them out and reinforce the volumes before moving on to the dreaded freehanding section. My plan here is to paint a bunch of Skaven symbols all over this scarf in different sizes as well as slightly different colors. They're all going to be desaturated from almost a dark neutral gray up into a mid-tone grayish brown and then a brighter off-white brown. Now my thought is that these symbols are actually sewn into the fabric and that they're going to fade naturally over time at the same rate that the scarf is. So how are we going to do this? My thought is that by glazing more thin layers of paint over the entire surface, we'll get the same level of fading that's happening with the colors on top that'll affect both the scarf and these symbols. And then when I build up some scratchy highlights on the symbols themselves and the surrounding areas, all that texture is going to kind of pull them together with the rest of the scarf. This was certainly the scariest part of this entire project thus far. I have no experience with it and zero confidence in my ability to do freehand work. And this was mostly just lines and symbols, but I didn't know how it was going to turn out. In fact, I wasn't happy with how it was looking by the time I needed to have all my painting footage ready for today's video. So what I did was just got to editing on this video so I could get it done in time, while in the evenings still putting more hours into this scarf till it got to the point where I'm pretty happy with it. Now this video's work on my Golden Demon project was both the most scary and kind of the most reassuring. I figured out recipes for different materials that I'll be using going forward in all sorts of projects, and hopefully there's something you could use from those recipes and try in your own projects. I'm fairly happy with how these sections combined with Vizic's head will act as our centerpiece on this massive model. But I think even more important than that, this section of the model being complete has given me a burst of energy that I'm going to need to finish this project before the deadline is up. There's still lots to do. It's a lot of small details. Everything is going to take more time, but every project has that peak of the hill you need to climb up in order to have a smoother walk down the other side to the finish line. The work this week reminded me of that. No matter what miniature project you're working on, you have that hill to climb. Whether you've made it a Mount Everest for yourself for a massive Golden Demon project, or you just want to paint a model quickly so you're slapping around color, so you just have a gentle hill to climb. Either way, you're going to have to reach to that top and then enjoy your ride down the other side to the end. My hope is that you too see your next miniature painting project to completion, and then once you do, you take a moment to be proud of the work that you've done and the model that you have to show for it. If you like the channel and the videos that I create here and you want to support it, please hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. You could also check out the Ninjon merch store below and use my affiliate links below to get your hobby goodies at a discount. That supports me as well. And of course, there's always the Ninjon Patreon. I've got a link down there as well. As a thank you for joining us on the Ninjon Patreon, you get some fun rewards like access to my Discord server, my weekly Wednesday behind the scenes painting vlog, and of course, my unedited full footage of some of my painting projects like the Golden Demon one. Regardless of what you decide, thank you so much for joining me on this Golden Demon journey. This has been the largest lift I've ever attempted, and I really appreciate you joining me for it. Now, I will be back again next week with another new video. Just make sure that sometime between now and then, you find time in your day to slay the gray.